My name is Jiang. I work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm a geographer. I've been working in Inner Mongolia since early 1990s, 1991. My initial concern was really about land use, environmental issues, and that really led me to look at cultural issues and Chinese migration into the area. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really about the Chinese migration into Inner Mongolia and related land use issues in western part of Inner Mongolia. It's a place called Grasslands in western Inner Mongolia. In the whole area called the Altos Plateau. So that's been my study area since 1991. Chinese migration into Inner Mongolia really in the whole region really started in the late Qing dynasty, especially after the 1700s. But in my study area in Grasslands, the earlier migration really happened in 1920s when I interviewed the migrants in 2000. I checked with them and asked them when they first entered into the area. So the early migrants really were mostly poor farmers who tried to escape the crop failure or political unrest or other problems like epidemic disease. So they came into Inner Mongolia really search for a living. And those are really the bulk of the early migrants. And there were also merchants, especially merchants who sold salt, medicine, and daily goods. And those people would pass in Mongolia and build some good relationship with the Mongols and decide to stay. And so these were the early migrants into the area. And the bulk, like I said, of the migrants were really very, very poor. They came in really almost like with nothing with them. They probably brought a couple of cooking pots, some bowls and some beddings, and that's all probably they ever had. And some people who were a bit richer would bring like a couple of chickens with them. And they came in and they tried to make a living. And they first would work for a Mongol family. And later on, they started to build up their own family and eventually probably have a couple of sheep and goats and start to have their own land to crop. So those were the early migrants, Chinese migrants into the area. Early migrants were mostly men who came usually single. Even if they have family, they leave their family behind. And after they start to establish themselves in Inner Mongolia, then they start to take their family with them. What's interesting about the population growth of the Chinese is that because the Chinese have this tradition of wanting to have a big family represents happiness. Lineage is an important issue. Therefore, the Chinese immigrants tend to have a very big family. Like when I interview people, I ask them how many children they had and how many children their children had, and on and on. And it's common to find that they had 8 or 9 children. So Chinese migrants came into the area, started with this single man, for example, maybe a brothers, 2 people in the family. And later on, in 2000, when I interviewed them about how many people have grown starting from the 2 people in 1920s, and they would count like 80, 90, sometimes over 100 people. So that really is this natural growth of the Chinese migrants really constitute the most of the Chinese population growth in the area. And one interesting phenomenon of these early Chinese migrants into Inner Mongolia is the Chinese conversion into Mongols, which is really unique in this area of Grasslands. What happened was that after they moved into the area, traditionally they farm, so they want to farm and open the grassland to farm. But the local regulation was that if they were not a local person, if they were not Mongols, they could not farm. And in order to be able to farm, then they seek ways to basically become Mongols. And the Mongolian area at the time also want to encourage people to come in and farm. And because of that mutual benefit, the local the local prince, the Wuxan prince, actually allowed Chinese to convert into Mongols if they have a strong relationship with a Mongolian family or with a Mongol. So what happened then is that a Chinese man may then become a sworn brother of a Mongol, then become literally registered as a Mongol, and after that they can start to open the grassland farm. And I've also interviewed people who have had a sworn relationship with the Mongol as a father, like they have the Mongol as their sworn father, and some have relationship with the lamas, who became their sworn brothers, so on and so forth. So then they were taken to be part of a Mongolian family. And a lot of these people, interestingly, really did adopt Mongolian customs and cultural values. And a lot of these people did start to adopt Mongolian customs and cultural values. For example, one important Chinese custom is really about the respect for the family and worshiping the ancestors. So they want to make sure they would, when after a person dies, he or she would want to be buried in the ancestral land. But the Mongolian tradition is that they basically want to put their dead body on the sand and let it decay naturally. So it's very different tradition. So one way I want to see how much of the converted Chinese really become a Mongol is to ask them about how they want to be buried after they die. And most people really did want to be brought back to their homeland in northern Shanxi, which is where they came from, Yulin area. But some people did say that they want to be just they want to have their dead body just laid on the grass, which I see as a really significant, which I really see as being significant, because that seems to me is indication of their really becoming more of a Mongol than a Chinese. So this Chinese conversion into Mongols is really a local phenomena for a limited period of time before 1949. This is really happening only in the early migrants that came in mostly between 1920s and early 1940s. After Chinese Communist Party took over the area in 1949, there were several recent waves of migration, Chinese migration into the area. So the first wave really happened in 1959, really right after the Great Leap Forward, when people in northern Shanxi really suffered from hunger from the Great Leap Forward, and they again came to the Mongolian area to make a living. What's interesting is that you see the Chinese people having lived a very difficult lives, and then they try to make a better living, and they come to Mongolian land. So that's the first wave, 1959. A lot of the people who came into the area actually later on were turned back by the local government. Only limited numbers of families stayed. So that's 1959. And the second wave was during the Cultural Revolution period, when the regional government really ordered the grassland to be opened into cropland. And then the local government wanted to attract more Chinese to come into the area to farm. And therefore that came the second recent wave of migration into the area. And the third wave is really more recent. Since the reform era in 1980s, the local towns started to be developed as a part of the local economic development, and they want to attract more population, and this population would be mostly the Chinese. But in terms of the overall Chinese population in Wuxan banner, who are involved in managing the land, the early migrants really constitute the bulk of the Chinese migration into the area. So next I want to talk about the impact of a Chinese migration on land use in the early socialist period, the Mao period. To understand land use in the Mao period, I think we really have to understand the socialist politics and socialist engineering of land. One thing about the early socialist period is really its aggressive views about land. Part of it really came from a Chinese tradition of the farming tradition of wanting to improve the land and see improvement as essential for economic benefit. But the Chinese socialist state really took that cultural tradition to the extreme. It's really influenced by the Marxist ideology of human over nature, and really advocated very aggressively the human improvement, human transformation of the landscape. For me as a geographer, knowing the physical geography of the landscape, that kind of desire to transform the sandy land is really disregarding the ecology of the area. There's only so much water, so much precipitation the area receives. There's only so much vegetation the area can support. So this desert campaign, this desert campaign really was trying to cover the whole area, the sand dunes, exposed sanded area, with vegetation. So it was a grand desire and grand plan. So in one of the local communities in Wuxen Banner, it's called Wuxenju, the local people, led by the local government leaders, really participated very actively in the campaign and actually became one of the models at the time in China. It became a so-called pastoral dazhai. Dazhai is this national model, and Wuxenju became the pastoral equivalent of the dazhai model, a model to transform, a model that tries to transform nature, that tries to basically overcome nature's adversaries. So in that campaign, the effort of the local people was really to plant on sandy land, plant shrub, plant trees on the sandy land. And in fact, what's interesting is that they did achieve a lot of good results in terms of converting certain parts of the sand dunes into usable pastures, which I actually was able to visit in 2000, and which I was able to visit in the late 1990s and 2000. What's interesting is that the local people were able to convert some of the exposed sand dunes into usable pastures, which I was able to visit in the late 1990s and 2000. So there were some good results that was achieved really by the great ingenuity of the local people. But at the same time, there were also a lot of great waste of effort and failures in terms of these efforts in the desert campaign. So that's about the 1958 and 1965. The effort had both achieved some success and some failures. And after that, we enter into the Cultural Revolution period, and the story is a totally disastrous one. The regional government at the time was taken over by a group that was really leftist Maoist group. That was really trying to follow the national policy of what's called grain first policy. So in the Inner Mongolia area, then this new local, in Inner Mongolia area, then this new regional government implemented a policy to expand cropland, which means to convert grassland into cropland, opening up more grassland. Grassland opening has always been a very sensitive issue, an issue that is a lot of times in historical period was a cause of Chinese-Mongolian conflict, because the Mongolian tradition is use the grassland for grazing, and Chinese would go in and open it up. And that's always been a crux for conflicts. And now this opening started again. And mind you, the Mongolian land has been opened for many different periods in history. And by this time, in the 1960s, suitable land for cropland, suitable areas for cropping already was opened up. So now, as the regional government ordered more opening of grassland, the opening really happened on areas that's very dry, not suitable for cropping at all. So what happened was that after the land was opened up, then the sand would be activated, and the area would quickly turn into very, very degraded land. So again, when I visited in the area in 1990s, I would be taken by my informants to these areas of degraded sandy land, and I was told this is the area that was opened during the Cultural Revolution. So very much a disastrous result. In terms of this whole Mao period, where does the Chinese migrants come in? The problems with regard to land degradation really came mostly from the state's erroneous policies. The Chinese migrants come in terms of executing the cropland expansion policies. When the government said you need to open more cropland, then it's the Chinese who had the technique to do the cropping. So they would become the actual, almost like executors. They will become the executors of this state erroneous policy. Again, what's interesting is that you see history always changes and transforms, and situation will become different. At the time, during the Cultural Revolution, in one of the communities I studied in Wuxin Banner, I talked to the local Chinese migrants, and they were talking about how during the Cultural Revolution they were assigned to this cropping specialty team, which was given the resources for cropping, given the money to develop irrigation schemes, but as part of the let me see how I say this. But later on, after 1980s, when land was distributed to individual households, then these people, these Chinese who were part of the cropping specialty team, received more cropland, but very little pasture land. And other people living in other areas receive more of a pasture land. So at the time, it would seem like a benefit. They get more cropland, other people didn't. But later on, as irrigation technology developed into the area, then these, especially the Mongols who had more pasture land distributed to them, were able to develop a lot of the pasture land, especially pasture land that's flat around their house, into irrigated cropland. So they end up having a lot more land resources than these Chinese immigrants. So when I interviewed these Chinese immigrants in 2000, they were really complaining about their loss at not having enough land distributed to them. So we can see this kind of historical turn of events that would benefit the Chinese, but later on would make it a little bit difficult for them to expand their household economy. So in Inner Mongolia, in my study area, the economic reform really started since the early 1980s, when the livestock and grassland were both distributed to households. And economic activities were also centered now around the households. So households, individuals started to be given more decision-making power in land use. So in this case, this is when the Chinese migration interaction with the Chinese, Mongolian interaction with the Chinese became more important in terms of the land use in the Inner Mongolian area. Take cropland, for example. Cropland really started to expand in the early 1960s or late 1950s during the desert campaign. But the area was still very limited because the irrigation technology was at the time very limited. But by early 1980s, mainly around 85, 86, in Wuxenbanner, the small-scale irrigation well technology started to be developed. So when I interview people who were basically pioneers in leading the development of the irrigation technology, I interviewed people, asked them about where they learned about the technique of digging the irrigation wells. And invariably they talk about having traveled to the Chinese area, to the Yunnan area, where it was the exodus of the early Chinese immigrants into the Inner Mongolian area, into Wuxenbanner. So the Mongols would travel into the Chinese area to learn irrigation and other agricultural-related techniques. And after that, they bring the techniques back, and then those techniques started to expand in Inner Mongolia. Irrigated cropland started to really expand since 1985-86. So that's I call that more of an indirect linkage because here it requires the Mongols to travel out to the area. I call this indirect linkage with the Chinese because it requires the Mongols to travel to the outside area. And there are also direct linkages. The direct linkages would be the Chinese migrants who are already living in Inner Mongolia, in Wuxenbanner. In my work, I focus on two communities. In one of the communities called Sharlige. So Sharlige has a lot of Chinese migrants who live in that area. So over time, the Mongols in the area really were becoming much more accepting of the Chinese land use technologies, including farming, including some of the improvement techniques like planting of trees, shrubs, and grass. So in 2000, when I interviewed the different households in Sharlige, what I was I found that I was told that each household had about 50 more of cropland, irrigated cropland. That's almost more than double the size of cropland equivalent Chinese family would receive in a farming area in northern Shanxi. And that's really interesting because here you have Mongols who traditionally is a pastoral people who don't do cropping, but now they actually have more cropland than the Chinese. So you can start to see a lot of the cultural change already just from this one piece of information. So the reason they were able to really expand their cropland, of course, you have the irrigation technology, and the area also has a very good store of groundwater. Although the annual precipitation is low, it's a dry area, but the groundwater supply is pretty good. So those conditions, plus the cultural influence from the Chinese, really allowed the Mongols to develop more of to expand their cropland. So that's the direct influence of the Chinese migration into the area. The Chinese who already live in the area have influence on the Mongolian land use styles and their ideas about how land should be used. The other interesting phenomena is a more recent phenomena started since 1980s, is the hiring of Chinese temporary laborers by the Mongolian families. And this again happened mostly in areas that has a lot of cropland. In Sharlige, for example, with so much more cropland. In Sharlige, for example, with so much cropland to take care of, plus each household also raise a couple hundred sheep and goats. So given that it was a lot of work and they could not possibly take care of everything, so they end up hiring the temporary Chinese workers. And these would be, again, people from the northern Shanxi area who come to, again, make a better living. So these Chinese temporary workers will be hired to perform tasks related to cropping and planting. So again, it's a labor-intensive and activities that mostly coming from the Chinese tradition. So in terms of cropping, the hired workers would take care of the crop for the entire season, mostly corn in this area, and the cost and expenses are both shared half and half with the host. So this arrangement was really very similar to the arrangements before 1949. In Charligue, about 10% of the households, mostly Mongolian households, hire Chinese laborers. And like I said, mostly temporary laborers, meaning the seasonal labor who would crop here and then leave at the end of the season. But there are also some of these temporary laborers actually started to stay in the area year round, became live-in kind of laborer. Again, this is a new phenomena, and these laborers would bring their family and children. Their children would go to school in the area, and they would also rent some pasture land from the host and be able to raise to raise sheep and goats. So all in all, the experience of the early Chinese migration into the area and also the recent Mongolian hiring of Chinese laborers really contradict with this image of the Chinese being the oppressors and the Mongols being the victims. So at the national level, of course, we can look at the Chinese as this dominant majority who oftentimes disregard the Mongolian interest and the Mongolian traditions. But in the local area, in Wuxenbanner, from the early experience of the Chinese migrants were really from mostly the poor people who come into the area and to try to make a living. And recent the temporary laborers being hired by the Mongols. It's an interesting phenomena that make the Chinese-Mongolian relationship more complicated. So the last issue I want to address is the complicated consequences of a Mongolian cultural change and the grassland change. As I mentioned earlier, the increase in cropland and also the increase in planted trees and grass and shrub. With this land use change came Mongolian cultural change, the change in food habits, in housing, in their attitude about life, attitude about nature, about the grassland, so on and so forth. So what I want to focus here is really the Mongolian cultural change that's related to the grassland. The Mongols are people of the nomadic tradition, traditionally use the grassland and identify themselves as such, as a pastoral people or nomadic people. But with this land use change, now the area has really become an agro-pastoral area with a lot of agricultural intensive land use ingredients. So how do then the Mongol then identify themselves now? Do they still see themselves as pastoral people? Do they still see grassland as an important part of the Mongolian identity? So that was the research question I brought with me into the field. And when I asked my informants, my Mongolian informants, how do they see the change? Do they think of themselves now as less Mongol? Do they feel like they've become more Chinese? And interestingly, their answer was no, that they expressed their views that the Mongolian culture has to change with time. And change with time, this almost became a motto of the Chinese society. There are a lot of changes going on. So the Mongolians really see themselves as part of this change and had to follow this change. And in order to follow the change and to have a better economy, they have to change their cultural ways and their cultural traditions. And that's how they see it, and most people have no problem with the change that's going on. So the Mongols really see themselves as being part of the change, and in order to have a better economic status, to improve their lives, they need to change their cultural traditions to follow this basically national trends, all in that sense a global trend of change. When I ask my Mongolian informants how do they when I ask my Mongolian informants what they identify with that is different from the Chinese, in other words, how they distinguish themselves from the Chinese, what's interesting is that these answers I got was the Genghis Khan, the portrait lineage that's linking back to Genghis Khan was really the most important feature, was the most frequently mentioned. So other than that, they also mentioned the Mongolian banners that they erect in front of their house, and the Mongolian language and the Mongolian tradition of hospitality. In other words, they've moved their identification away from land use practices, away from pastoral practices, and onto something that's more symbolic. And so this transference to symbolic identity really empowers the Mongols, and also at the same time allows more room for more aggressive land use practice to increase in the area. Of course, not all Mongols feel totally 100% fine with this kind of change. Some people do express ambivalent about the change, and some people would say, well, you know, our ancestors didn't farm, and now we had to farm, and we feel forced that we had to farm. But then at the same time also express the preference of farming so that they can have better economic life, and they don't want to go back to the traditional nomadic practice under which they would have to live a very, very difficult economic life. So as I mentioned, the Mongolian cultural change really allowed more room for the increase of aggressive land use, farming, planting of trees. I'll give you an example. In one of the communities I studied in Wuksanju, in In 1949, there were about 94 trees all around a Lama temple. By 2000, when I interviewed the area, each household had about 1,500 trees. So that's a tremendous change, a very significant change in the land use practices. So let me give you an example. In Wuksanji, one of the communities I study, in 1949, there were 94 trees all around a local Lama temple. By 2000, when I interviewed, each household had about, on average, 1,500 trees. So that's a tremendous change on an area that is a dry land. With the cultural change, so the cultural change allowed more of these changes in land use to occur. So what's the consequence of these aggressive land use practices on the whole of the landscape? So that's the last question I want to address. As I mentioned earlier, this is a dry land that has its natural limitations. And especially the key limitation is really the water. There's a limited precipitation, and there's a good condition of groundwater, but the groundwater has to be replenished in order for the use to be sustainable. But with the increase in cropping, irrigated cropping, with the increase in planting of trees and shrub and grass, the groundwater table is lowered. And that lowering of a groundwater table also affected adjacent landscape. So what happened in terms of the whole landscape in the area is that some parts of the land, when you have this aggressive use, improvement did occur. Improvement in the sense of improved biomass. You have more crops produced, more leaves produced, more biomass produced, basically. And that's the area where humans have really put in a lot of effort. But on the other hand, you have these other parts of the landscape that's degraded, and the degradation continue to increase. And if you just think about the groundwater being used by one part of the landscape, then you have less available for other parts of the landscape, and therefore this other part is suffering. So as a result of this land use change, you have a simultaneous trend of improvement on the one hand. As a result of the aggressive land use, you have improvement on the one hand, and you have a degradation happening on the other hand. So you have this simultaneous trend going on of both improvement and degradation. And these two trends are actually not only parallel, but also related. If you keep improving the landscape, then this other trend is going to keep going on. So that's really the complicated consequences of the land use change in this area that in the long run is not going to be sustainable.